I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
Hello, and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 25th of July 2022. I am joined, as ever, by my hopefully slightly cooler co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. It was rather hot last week, and it's quite humid this week. How are you doing?
It's not quite sort of the jungles of Central Africa here, but it is quite close and humid in London. Although actually, it has been quite a day. When we finish recording, I'm going to curl up with the judge's written judgment from the Wagatha Christie trial, which broke at lunchtime and has been one of the probably the highlights this year, certainly in the legal world.
Okay. Well, fair enough, I suppose. Fair enough. For
our viewer outside the UK, just Google it. I'm not going to try and explain it.
No. In other slightly more serious news, though, this is actually the week that the conflict in Ukraine surpassed 150 days. That was on Sunday. Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, we've actually lined up follow-up interviews with Paul and Alina. We're going to be recording those early next week just to get a sense of where things are now, 150 plus 7 days later. But before we are able to do that, we figured we would return to a story that was floating around the internet and especially Twitter, etc., in particular Archaeology Twitter, last weekend. And it's the very first story that you and I ever covered together on Watching Brief, Andy, and that is Stonehenge. That's going to be the main course.
Oh, have we covered that before? Have we actually covered that before?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I always forget, but we have apparently covered Stonehenge before. So go on.
No, what I was going to say was it's the gift that keeps on giving, or the embarrassing aunt that keeps on turning up at the wedding, or however you want to describe it. That's the story, and we'll be coming back to it later in the show.
Yeah, it's the smell that never quite dissipates.
You are talking about one of the most important archaeological sites in Western Europe, if not the world.
Do you know, you wouldn't think so, would you, given the dignity that the conversation is given? But again, we'll come back to that in a moment. Before we do that, we have a series of news lines that we want to bring to your attention, folks at home. Starting with another thing that came up recently. So it's very similar to the Star story that we covered on Watching Brief a couple of weeks ago, and that is the Daily Mail and others getting angry about quote woke archaeologists who want to deny the ability to assign a gender or race to human remains. Woke activists are demanding this, apparently, and this comes from we're linking here to anthrodendum.org, which outlines the actual roots of this story. I mean, this is another story. It's storm in a teacup, isn't it? Because archaeologists don't assign gender for the most part. Osteologists assign sex, and even then, it's a best guess. What's going on?
Yeah, look. I mean, basically, it's another woke warrior hit job from the Mail, trying to keep the idea that all academics are left-wing woke warriors trying to do down history. Just trying to give that story legs. So every so often, and there's another story along the same lines we'll be coming to in a moment. In this case, it is taking a perfectly legitimate discussion that has been going on for years again in academia about the assignment of sex characteristics and gender to human remains from the past, when we don't know how people identified themselves. There's a famous case. I was going to say that there are famous cases in the archaeological literature, particularly, for example, from Viking Europe, where graves that were assigned originally to males have been found on when scientific tests have been done, DNA in particular, they've been found to be graves of females.
Yeah,
and
for example, the idea of all warriors are men, or all bodies that are buried with mirrors and combs are women. This kind of thing in various places. That is all about examining the context of human remains in order to understand how they might have lived. And even then, shock horror, folks at home, people in the past didn't necessarily primarily identify themselves by their sexuality. They certainly didn't primarily identify themselves by their skin color. So it's fascinating how this is such a the right wing press looking for a reason to be angry, and unfortunately, a lot of archaeologists still don't quite know how to respond to it. It seems to be either a case of ignore, it'll go away. It won't.
Which I no, exactly.
or it's a case of people getting disproportionately angry at the story when it's a nothing. It's just they're just trying to make people angry. Yeah.
I think the serious point, and the reason we mention these stories is, I think, as you said, you can't just ignore stuff because it won't just go away. These people, if they don't have access to the levers of power, they have access to large chunks of the media, and they have access at the moment to people in government. They influence people in government, and you can't ignore that.
No, they also influence the electorate, which influences public spending priorities and so on and so forth.
Precisely. So this is something. It won't go away. We'll keep on covering the story. You can't just ignore it.
But nonetheless, that wasn't a primary. I mean, the other day we gave the Star story top billing. This week we just figured we'd just point at it and explain it.
It's part of the supporting program.
Absolutely. An extension of this conversation, or indeed war on woke, as some people are describing it, can be seen in a link from The Guardian that we're sharing below, with the headline that Nadine Dorries has granted listed status to the Cecil Rhodes plaque at Oxford College. At an Oxford college, sorry.
Sorry. It's just that you're reading that out. It's just the idea of Nadine Dorries having the level of knowledge to grant listed status to anything. Is quite
Dynamite Dorries. Remember,
Dynamite Dorries. Yeah. Dynamite Dorries, as we call it, because of what happened to the
Incidentally, are we still likely to be talking about that in the not too distant future?
Yes, we are, in short, but watch this space, because I'm still trying to track down documents and so on connected with that story.
Well,
but, we're coming up for the first anniversary, so hopefully we'll have something by then.
Okay, we'll obviously watch this space, but also watch that watching brief, or listen to it if you're curious as to what we're talking about. I'll link below.
I mean, look. Now, in all seriousness, this particular story, it's an extension of the row at Oriel College in Oxford. The original row was about a statue of the Victorian imperialist Cecil Rhodes, who was a benefactor to Oxford. He was an Oxford man himself, and he was a benefactor to Oxford. And that's often quoted as a reason to keep his visible presence in the city, although he was controversial in his own time, and probably one of the most outspoken and outrageous in many respects imperialists of the period. There's been a long-standing campaign, often given in shorthand as Rhodes Must Fall, to take down the statue. The statue was already listed. What Dorries has done is list a biographical plaque which is close by, and the idea being that, I mean, it's a provocation. It apparently has been done without against the advice of Historic England, which normally makes a recommendation to the Secretary of State for Culture, which Nadine Dorries is, and that advice is normally followed, but it hasn't been in this case. Historic England argued that the plaque lacks the richness of detail required for listed status. A spokesperson for Ms. Dorries said that the plaque had architectural interest as a, quote, fine example, end quote, of a genre. It was created by a notable sculptor, a man called Onslow Whitting, and it is, quote, an unusual and elaborate personal tribute. And then Dorries' statement added, Cecil Rhodes was a nationally and internationally important individual whose life and work impacted fundamentally on the story of British imperialism in Southern Africa in the late 19th century. Now, by drawing attention to his career in Southern Africa in the late 19th century, including illegal invasions and the exploitation of native people, that might not have it might not quite be the flag being waved for the British Empire that she thinks it is. But as I say, it's been designed to provoke a reaction, I think, in the Rhodes Must Fall campaign and promote the government's position of quote retaining and explaining heritage.
But also as well, this is a spokesperson for her. This isn't a heritage expert who made that analysis.
No.
And in the week when the Festival of Archaeology reached its zenith, it seems, I can't help but wonder how seriously archaeological experts are actually being taken by government. But we'll come back to that, I'm sure, when we talk about Stonehenge. Moving on from that, then we go to an even further extreme in the cultural conversation, and that is a blog post here, Guy Walters. Writing about the wrongness of dressing up in SS uniform.
That's right.
This is as a reenactor, I'm guessing, yes?
Yeah, but so far as I'm aware, thankfully, the Waffen-SS hasn't been recruiting for at least 80 years. No, look, this is a blog post. Guy Walters, people who aren't familiar with his work, Guy Walters is quite a well-known historian and journalist. Primarily, he writes about issues to do with the 20th century, particularly the Second World War. He's done a lot of work on war criminals and the search for war criminals after World War II. Mm-hmm. The article in question, it's on his Substack, and the whole point of it really, it's an argument that's been around in the living history and reenacting world for a while. I'll read you what Walter says, or a part of what Walter says. He says, talking about the We Have Ways Fest, which is Murray and Holland's festival. Mm-hmm. I was delighted not to see anybody wearing SS uniform, although there were plenty of reenactors at the fest. Not one was sporting a telltale lightning rings on a collar tab or wearing a cap complete with a death's head. Indeed, the nearest thing SS was a replica SS armoured personnel carrier with an SS number plate, which didn't seem too offensive. In addition, I don't think I saw a single wartime German uniform during the entire event. 5 years ago, the situation was very different. At many history festivals, there would have been several, often, let's be honest, quite portly men walking around dressed as members of the SS. If anybody had remarked perhaps that wearing such uniform was tasteless or even downright offensive, the stock response was that all sides of the conflict needed to portray, and that by not having the Waffen-SS troops as part of the reenacting community, history was somehow being airbrushed. Now, and he goes on in a similar vein. And I've certainly heard those arguments myself, and it's something I've taken a lot of interest in. I mean, I know you've occasionally dressed in period clothes as well, doing interpretations. I certainly have. It can be a very powerful tool.
Yeah, it can be, but the thing is, I mean, I'm not a reenactor, never have been, but I have friends who are and who do. And one of the things that often happens is that you take on, often even just for a laugh, but also as part of the portrayal, and a characterization of the thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and behaviors of the person or people that you are representing. So, for example, the classic one is the grumpy Viking who, can't stand Christians. At a certain point in Viking history, that would be, or Norse history. I don't think there's any healthy way to reenact SS officers. I don't think you can go around extolling any of the quote unquote virtues that they held. And if you're saying, "Oh, I'm just dressing like one," what's the value of that? Indeed, you might as well have a mannequin with the uniform on, if you must. So it's and actually in that sense, it is also. It's just too close. I mean, if that is the living memory, and also its meaning is still very potent, as we're seeing in various places around the world at the moment. If you think about just how long ago, for example, the Norse attack on Lindisfarne was, that was 793 AD or CE. There's been a good buffer of time, and now you can represent a version of those events which which isn't as resonant and isn't going to inspire people to think that it's cool, for example, to attack a church. So it's a little bit like the conversation surrounding whether or not it's okay for someone to build a ship called Titanic 2. This is a spectrum, and I'm sure there'll be people out there who will say, well, if you can't do SS, then you can't do British Armed Forces at the time, or Indian troops or Australian troops. No, that's not the case. and I think even though it's hard necessarily to explain fully the exact gradations here, I think there's a certain amount of common sense that will lead you down the right path.
That's right. And like I say, I'm not attacking reenactors' living history, and I don't think Guy is either.
No,
it's a particular. It's the representation of particular points of view. For example, I get equally offended, I think, if somebody represented uncritically, for example, an antebellum Southern slave owner doing in a United States context. But I think the thing that fixed it for me about particularly the Second World War, and particularly Second World War Nazi organizations, was I was at a living history show once, and on the camp where the SS were displaying their wares and their equipment and their propaganda posters and so on, were two children, 11, 12. One was wearing Hitler Youth uniform. The other one was wearing the uniform of I think it's the League of German Maidens, the Deutsche Mädchenbund. And to my mind, there was no reason for that.
No.
And you wonder what were those children told? How could those children respond if somebody asked them a question about what are you wearing? Why are you dressed like that? And I thought about this a lot, and I responded, in fact, to Guy article in a Twitter thread. And one of the things I said, thinking it through, was that if you take a film like The Villa, the recreation of the Wannsee Conference, which decided the final solution, Kenneth Branagh, one of our finest actors, played Reinhard Heydrich. Now, no one would suggest that Kenneth Branagh espoused the views of Reinhard Heydrich.
No.
He's an actor playing a role. And in the same way that the actors in Band of Brothers on both sides were playing roles, including in one sequence in the second episode, the execution of SS prisoners by an American paratrooper, which is very dark, very edgy. It's not the D-Day of legend.
No.
But it's historically accurate. Things like that did happen on both sides, again, I have to say. But that kind of thing isn't allowed in arena shows, in living history shows, because it's seen as perhaps distasteful. It spoils the entertainment. You have to explain it. You have to put it in context.
No, but that's the word, isn't it? Entertainment.
SS, exactly.
Mass graves, war crimes should not be entertainment.
That is exactly the point.
Yeah,
that's exactly the point. That you can dress an actor in a uniform in a contextualized script, and they can play that role, and then the camera stops rolling and they cease to be that person, and they take that uniform off as soon as possible.
Yeah.
When you're living that life for an entire weekend, surrounded by the propaganda posters and the equipment that's built by slave labor in a factory and things like that,
and lining up your ice cream at lunch, this kind of thing, mingling
and if
with the
you're
crowd.
Exactly, and if you're not explaining that, then what are you doing?
Yeah.
Put bluntly, we can't always be sure they're pretending, and I think that's the thing that means that perhaps it's time to put away those uniforms.
I agree. The thing is, though, as well, I do think, though, it's possible to have fun with some of this stuff. It is possible to portray. I mean, I was at a community event before COVID where there was a couple who they go around pretending to be sort of medieval-ish dungeon keeper and poor person who's being whipped by the dungeon keeper. And we don't see either. Well, we don't see the poor person's face because they're all sort of like, "Meow," all sort of, it's a bit Baldric. It's a bit kind of like, Man in the Iron Mask kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's done for fun, and it's done very tongue in cheek. They are a cartoon character, and they represent themselves as such. And what's interesting there is that occasionally they were saying to me that they do have people come up to them and say, you're making fun of the denigration of human beings. You're portraying torture and so on and so forth in making light of it. And their comeback, the reason why they have the prisoner dressed up in a way that's non-identifiable, is he goes, the prison keeper goes, "Sir, what gives you the impression that what's under that hood is a human being?" And then they move on. That's pantomime. And again, as with all of this, there are gradations, but I think there's an intuitive way forward that doesn't lead you, for example, to dressing kids up in Hitler Youth costume.
That's the thing. And you can argue that, for example, yes, perhaps if you're going to do an arena show of a simulated battle to show off vehicles and keep those vehicles running, those pieces of industrial heritage and so on, maybe it's appropriate to perhaps dress appropriately for the crews for the duration of that event. But to live it for the whole weekend with philosophy and so on, that I think is edging into quite a place that maybe instinctively a lot of people feel uncomfortable with. And it's interesting, a colleague with a lot of experience of this world and also military history world was saying that the modern view, for example, until relatively recently, the Kriegsmarine, the Luftwaffe, and the regular German Wehrmacht, the regular army, were seen as somehow more acceptable because they were, quotes, clean organizations. They weren't as penetrated by the Nazi ideology as the SS, which was an ideological party organization. It wasn't part of the regular armed forces. It was a separate formation.
It was a cult.
Amongst other things. Yeah. And it had various different functions as well.
And they had
including...
And they had iconography and ceremony and other things associated with their unit and their order. I think at one point they were even described as sort of almost like knights. So it's not dressing up and showing off hardware. It's breathing life into deeply troubling things and things that we shouldn't make light of.
And also, it has to be said, it's showing off iconography, for example, that will be illegal in certain parts of Europe.
Illegal in Germany, yeah, definitely.
Indeed, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the point about the other the Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, and the Luftwaffe is that recent research has shown that actually the Nazi system and Nazi ideology and the actions such as war crimes that were associated particularly with the SS were actually far more prevalent in other formations too during World War II. And it's not to say that the Allies didn't do things that were contrary to the Geneva Convention either. It's just not on the same scale, nearly on the same scale. There is no equivalence. There's something particularly dark, I think, about those runes and those symbols.
Yeah. What I will also say is that I actually quite often on Facebook Marketplace see people here in the northeast of England selling Nazi memorabilia. I've had a couple of Hitler busts recommended to me because I'm interested in history, and obviously the algorithm doesn't know any better. The other day there was a Hitler nutcracker where his arm is up. I won't do the gesture. His arm is up, and you pull his arm forward and down to make his mouth crack the nut that you put in his mouth. I think there's a certain lightness that these things are carried with here in the UK, possibly because we won the war, inverted commas, that is troublesome. And I think actually making statements like this at reenactors events will hopefully start to bring questions into the other part of this community, and that is the broader collecting community. Why are we collecting this imagery? Why do we put it on a shelf? Why do we try and sell it openly on Facebook Marketplace? I can't. I can only imagine what it would be like if you tried to sell an Adolf Hitler nutcracker from 1930s Germany in Germany today. It would be horrific, or you'd have to do it on the black market because it wouldn't be allowed.
Well, that's the thing; it's done under the counter, absolutely.
Yeah,
and in fact, you hear anecdotal reports, for example, of reenactors from parts of Europe where those uniforms, that iconography is illegal, coming over here to follow their hobby.
Yeah,
because then
it's complicated.
It's complicated, but no, it's well known on the military history circuit, on the military antiquities circuit, on the eBay circuit, that there is a premium for Nazi material, a particular premium for SS material like daggers, and there are a huge number of lucrative fakes around because it's worth taking the trouble to fake them and fake them well because they sell for lots of money.
Yay. Our next and final line to keep an eye on before we head into talking about Stonehenge. Actually, you were joking, I think, about how this might undermine Stonehenge, no pun intended, entirely. And that is this notion that carbon dating may well be hampered by rising fossil fuel emissions. Now, we have previously on Watching Brief covered a story where there was a claim that carbon dating is entirely flawed. It wasn't in that instance. But in this instance, is there something to be taken seriously on nature.com?
Yeah, look, I'm not a carbon dating expert by any means, but this is it's a serious article in Nature, which is a respected science magazine by and large. It's the article came out 2 days ago. It's called "Carbon Dating Hampered by Rising Fossil Fuel Emissions," and it's by one of their writers, Nicola Jones, and it's all in the first paragraph. Researchers who track the ever-rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide have charted a landmark moment. As of 2021, the burning of fossil fuels has officially shifted the composition of carbon isotopes in the air of the Northern Hemisphere enough to cancel out the useful signal from nuclear weapons testing, which basically means you lose track of where you are on the carbon dating curves. And the article goes on to argue that this has been around, this argument, this suggestion that this moment will come has been around for some time, but it's now, that moment has now been reached, that carbon-14 will become increasingly less useful for dating, particularly for items that are found out of context. So that, particularly, obviously, the point about carbon dating is that organic material absorbs carbon while it's alive and then stops absorbing carbon while it's dead. It's possible to measure the amount of carbon-14 in an artifact and work out how long ago it stopped ingesting that carbon, because what's called the half-life of carbon-14 is known, so therefore you can it's a fixed time, and therefore you can work it out with some clever software. Yeah. And in fact, people are getting increasingly accurate with carbon dates with some very, very clever software.
Also, with increasingly smaller and smaller samples required as well. Yeah.
Indeed.
So this seems to fuzz the so-called plateau. Then, so there's a plateau in the curve, and this just makes it even harder to identify that.
That's right. It's and it's not just archaeologists who are going to be affected by this. Obviously, the dating of archaeological sites is potentially going to become more difficult. Again, this isn't switching off overnight, but the argument is it's going to become more and more difficult to use C14 accurately.
Yeah.
But I say it's not just archaeological sites; it also has an impact on the investigation of wildlife and heritage crime, because C14 is also used to work out whether, for example, something that is made of ivory is antique and legal or modern and illegal.
Yeah.
So this is it's a serious matter, and something that certainly in my archaeological career, I started looking at archaeology as a teenager in the 1970s, when C14 was a brilliant new technique, but it was just being recalibrated because of the tree ring data from bristlecone pines. And then it went through it was reinvented with the corrections from the bristlecone pine data, and then subsequently from the improvements in software and the mathematical models and so on. But now it looks as though it may be coming to the end of its frontline life, as it were, though it's not going to retire for a while yet. But it's, as I say, it's going to become increasingly difficult. So, which is a shame. And actually, the real shame, of course, is we're looking at what we're doing to the planet, and it's another reason perhaps for archaeologists to take a very serious look at what's going on in the environment that we all work in.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of the environment that we all work in, last week we were talking about heat waves and the heat that that the archaeologists, many of them, were having to work in this country, and there were some leads that came out of that conversation that we had that we would love to have pursued a little further, but unfortunately we couldn't. And this is all about information. If you could just very briefly, Andy, just sort of lay out how, if people have a story for us to follow, then they need to get in touch with us, privately or in DMs, etc.
Right. The basic thing is to be safe. And that means that if you're saying things that might get you into trouble, you need to find a secure way of being able to tell us without you putting yourself at risk. There are ways to do that. And if you contact us by direct message on Twitter, or by secure text on Signal, or on encrypted email, Proton Mail, not using a work account, in fact, not using a personal account, create a throwaway account if you want to talk to us. And we'll discuss with you what your story is and how safely we can bring it to the public without putting you at risk. We'll link to it below the line. There is an advice page on the Pipeline News website, which is specifically about whistleblowing. Okay. So if there's a story, as I say, if there's a story you want to tell us about, it's our duty to make sure you're safe. So talk to us, and we'll find a way of making things work in a way that's safe, but also enables us to tell your stories.
Okay, absolutely. And speaking of the watching brief and all the work that goes into it, we now have a short message from me. See you on the other side. A watching brief is a formal program of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you. So now, as promised, we come to Stonehenge and the ongoing conversation. I might say dumpster fire, but that's just a personal opinion. I'm
not going to disagree.
It's happening in and around that monument, and also within communities that I love and appreciate, not least the archaeological community. It all begins with this post that you've shared and put on the agenda from the StonehengeAlliance.org.uk. Redetermination process grinds on. Is this just the zombie story that'll never die? Are there egos involved? Are there people who simply can't be proven wrong? I don't know. Enlighten us.
It's all of the above. I mean, this story has been going on in its current form since at least the mid-1990s. So almost 30, approaching 30 years.
Okay.
And it shows no sign of ending anytime soon.
No.
Where we are now, almost exactly a year ago, the High Court quashed the permission that Transport Secretary Grant Shapps had given National Highways to build the A303 upgrade across the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site, which involves a short tunnel, not under the stones, but in the vicinity of the stones, which is designed to remove the A303 from the immediate Stonehenge environs, and then a dual carriageway across the rest of the landscape, rather than a longer tunnel, which which has been argued would be too expensive. That plan was found out to have been given the green light unlawfully by Grant Shapps.
Do you want to just repeat that?
So
Does you want to just repeat that?
Grant Shapps' decision to give the scheme the go-ahead was found to be unlawful.
Unlawful. Okay, good. Go
yes.
ahead. Yep.
Which means that it's subject to what's called a redetermination. The Secretary of State, Highways England, invited new responses, invited new information. Highways England. This is the thing. This has been going on for so long that Highways England, which is now called National Highways, has actually been rebranded about 3 times.
It's been rebranded. I went through puberty. I mean, a lot's happened. A lot's happened since this whole thing began.
This is the thing, right? The organisation now is called National Highways, right? So. And anyway, so National Highways have been submitting new information, and as of today, as of the time of recording, the closing date for submissions on some of the new information is the 3rd of August. It remains to be seen whether Transport Minister Shapps is going to make his redetermination before Boris Johnson leaves office at the beginning of September, or whether it's left for the new Prime Minister, whoever that is, and it looks likely it's going to be Liz Truss. I'm sorry, I had to say that. I know, I do apologise.
And so, can I just raise this loud for any international viewers? This isn't because she's a woman; it's because she's a moron. Like, to put it politely, she just look at old speeches she's given. The fact that she tried to claim that Russia was in Ukrainian territory when they had not yet crossed the border, to Sergei Lavrov's face, and had to have a British ambassador step in and correct her. She is unutterably thick, and yet that's the best apparently that might be coming up in for Prime Minister. And this isn't should also say this isn't partisan. I don't no. You know, this is just about whether or not the person can actually hold. Sorry, I'm ranting now. Go ahead.
all I was going to say is on that subject, before we close it and move on to talking about Stonehenge again, something uncontroversial. But no, that John Crace, the brilliant sketch writer in The Guardian, has christened Liz Truss, current Foreign Secretary, likely future Prime Minister, Raid on Liz, because she is both inert and poisonous.
I'd heard the brains truss previously.
Right. Well, anyway, look, let's draw a line under that. At the moment, Grant Shapps is the Transport Secretary. He may or may not make a redetermination before the new Prime Minister takes office. Now, we currently have what is technically an interim government, and interim governments aren't meant to make decisions that are binding on future governments. At the same time, and the potential red flag here, just this week, the government gave the go-ahead to Sizewell C nuclear power station against the advice of its expert advisors, and that would commit a future government. It's also highly controversial and would likely see them back in court.
Yeah. So fresh battle lines are being drawn once again, and with that in mind, you pop down to the British Museum, outside the British Museum, where Stonehenge Alliance were protesting towards the end of the Stonehenge exhibition that's been ongoing in that institution.
That's right. Basically, it's the rule of the vacuum. If there's a vacuum in something, material gets sucked in to fill the vacuum. The vacuum at the moment is the decision. While people are waiting for the decision, positions are being taken in preparation for that decision. And so we've actually had two pieces of public relations, basically, first from the Stonehenge Alliance, and secondly from National Highways. And as you say, the Stonehenge Alliance staged a public protest outside the British Museum 2 weeks ago, in the last days of the fabulous, it has to be said, World of Stonehenge exhibition. And the question they were asking was why, when we're celebrating the World of Stonehenge and its importance across certainly Western Europe, with pretty much an unprecedented collection of prehistoric finds, why was the exhibition not addressing the potential future of the monument and a construction scheme which the Alliance argues is irretrievably damaging to the landscape and is opposed by UNESCO, who administer World Heritage status.
It is a huge site. It covers hundreds and hundreds of acres, and it's been designated by UNESCO. If anything, the boundaries could be extended at some point. But it seems if the government's prepared to spend all this money, why do they need to build a good portion of the road within the World Heritage Site? There must be a more imaginative solution. And the one thing we can all agree on, surely, is that this is a unique and special landscape beyond anything else, probably anywhere in the world, possibly. And we need to do all we can to protect it, not drive roads through it.
The protest has happened here today at the British Museum. The current Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, is at the moment deciding on what happens regarding the A303 upgrade at Stonehenge. What do you think happens next, and what do you think happens if Mr Shapps decides to give the project the green light again?
Well, we've just had some more information given to the Secretary of State from National Highways about the road scheme, which we will be digesting and commenting on. Then he will presumably make his decision one way or another, or perhaps delay it. We don't know. But after all, our own government is in a state of flux at the moment, or it would seem. So we don't know what will happen, actually. If he decides to go ahead with it, we will go back to get legal advice to see whether or not his decision would need to be challenged.
It's actually nice to see faces and voices in this discussion. We don't necessarily want to share the entirety of the National Highways video in this report, but we can give you some footage to look at while we sort of, broadly speaking, describe it. It is a YouTube video, which is described on YouTube as a video where independent experts explain how the A303 Stonehenge scheme can provide real opportunities for not only archaeology but the Stonehenge monument and the surrounding landscape. I didn't realise that the Stonehenge monument was looking for opportunities. I thought it was quite happy in its current role, but I guess we'll understand what that means eventually. This was an interesting clip, wasn't it? Because it draws together some people who we know are advocates of a tunnel. People like Mike Pitts, for example, editor of British Archaeology.
British Archaeology, yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, the CBA's House magazine.
That's it, yeah. But also as well, other archaeologists who had been invited to comment on this project. I suppose for my part, when I saw it, first of all, I couldn't help but think that there was some a priori statements being made with logic that's being presented as already sorted out. You know, it is clear that, for example, this would have economic benefit. It is clear that, for example, this would have an environmental benefit. It is clear that, for example, this countryside should not have a road in it. And yet I can't help but think that actually, arguably, there's been a road there certainly longer than anyone here has been alive. There's been, in that sense, Stonehenge, as we've inherited it, has always had a road in its landscape. So there were some interesting conversations and arguments being made. What did you make of this as a presentation, as an infomercial? I think you've described it.
Yes, it is an infomercial. Basically a commercial that is putting a partisan point of view, but is actually using information which can be argued to be accurate, right? So it's not unbiased. It's a justification for what National Highways want to do.
It's Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's from a certain point of view.
Precisely that. Look, it was what was interesting was partly the way it was framed. It came out the day before. In fact, no, I think on the day that the Festival of British Archaeology, CBA's Festival of British Archaeology, its flagship event, was launched just down the road from you. And I'll read you the tweet that launched the video in social media, certainly on Twitter. It was the A303 Stonehenge account, which is maintained by National Highways. And it said, the hashtag Festival of Archaeology, which is the CBA's hashtag, celebrates the best of UK's history. To mark this event, we've spoken to several independent archaeologists about the history of Stonehenge and why they believe the hashtag A303 Stonehenge could transform the landscape for the better. Now, that's absolutely fine. And the video...
But except, sorry, in that statement, there is an admission of bias. We spoke to independent archaeologists and how it could change the landscape for the better.
Let me finish.
Okay, go ahead.
Look, they're admitting it's their piece. They're saying that there are lots of hostages to fortune in there. The word's independent. The word independent is using a lot of heavy lifting for a start. But the argument that it was somehow being linked to the Festival of Archaeology was probably a bit of a misstep. Now, we don't know if the CBA knew about this beforehand.
And why don't we know?
Because I asked them and they wouldn't respond.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry, they wouldn't respond. They haven't responded up to the time of...
Okay.
They haven't responded.
Okay.
However, the president of CBA, Raksha tweeted out almost immediately, and I'm quoting from her tweet here, no, the hashtag Festival of Archaeology celebrates diversity, equality, inclusion, and participation in our field within our communities, something that your film is lacking. Now, one of the points there is that all the participants were white and they were all male. But that's that's important in terms of representation, but it's not I think the main problem with it as a piece of work. It's unashamedly biased. They said, it's about trying to persuade the people who watch it that the A303 upgrade is good for the landscape. What it fails to mention, for example, is the fact that the scheme was found to be, basically the scheme and the configuration that National Highways want to go ahead with was rejected by the government's independent planning inspectors. It was found to be unlawful by the High Court, and it is unacceptable to UNESCO, who administer World Heritage status. So on three pretty serious ethical grounds, the project should be a non-starter.
Yeah. And in that sense, on grounds that, say, were they applied to the Giza Plateau and the Great Pyramids, I'm sure an awful lot of these people would have an awful lot to say about it. They wouldn't go, oh well,
yes.
They're right. They can blast their way through there if they want to,
Yes.
So in that sense, there's again emotional bias, nationalistic bias, and all sorts of other bias being presented here. And also, I should say, just for folks at home, and Mike, if he's watching, I'm not anti-tunnel per se. I'm anti unnuanced discussion happening. Is there anything else you want to say on that, or can we briefly talk about the unnuanced discussion?
I think the other thing I would say is that the latest news is that National Highways have made a submission to the Secretary of State which admits that a long tunnel, and I need to read the report because the headline seems really strange, a cut and cover longer tunnel, which actually would be as damaging to the landscape in some respects.
So you dig a huge trench and then you grass over the top of it, right? Okay,
that's right. Yeah. A partially cut and covered long tunnel would be more slightly more acceptable on heritage grounds, but they still maintain that in terms of cost and other factors, the plan as they already have it is the best solution. It's something I asked Kate Fielden from the Stonehenge Alliance when I met her at the British Museum the other week. What happens next? Now, obviously, if Grant Shapps or Grant Shapps' successor rejects the plan, then it's game over for the time being. Everybody goes back and thinks again, and probably comes up with a new plan in a year or two or a decade. You know, the other alternative is that Grant Shapps or Grant Shapps' successor gives the go-ahead again. And then it's clear from what Kate Fielden said to me at the British Museum, they will look at options for taking the government to court again. In short, it still has some way to run. Whatever decisions made in Whitehall, this isn't over.
No. And neither is the Bickering. And I do want to talk about this because it was all over my social media. If you're not a member of the archaeological community, you can tune out. But at the same time, you might see this and it might be less than edifying for you. And that is archaeologists not only discussing the merits of different schemes and different approaches to an internationally known, internationally famous, internationally significant monument, but also examining technique that's being proposed on the site and being thought to be impugning other archaeologists' professionalism. I'm not sure. Do we want to go down the route of actually naming people and what's, you know, it was such a mess.
I don't.
No.
Yeah, I don't, because I mean, you used the phrase dumpster fire earlier. It was a dumpster fire. I think there were mistakes made on both sides, particularly of interpretation, which don't show.
Now, this is where I do want to just sort of point something out. I don't think there's two sides to this. I think there's several sides to this. In so much as I don't think it's pro-tunnel and pro-commercial archaeology versus anti-tunnel and anti-archaeology or anti-professionalism or anti the perception of professionalism archaeology. I think there are also archaeologists involved in this who don't like the way this argument is reflecting back on them and don't like the fact that certain high-profile archaeologists can be read to have suggested that commercial archaeology doesn't do archaeology properly. So I think there's actually more than two sides to this. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted just to touch on it, if that's okay.
I think what we saw on one particular day, that particular Sunday, when those particular comments from a significant Stonehenge expert and academic archaeologist were people who primarily came from the developer-funded part of the profession, took exception to, because they felt that their professionalism was being impugned. Now, I don't think it was, because if you read the comments, they actually the archaeologist concerned actually talks about some archaeologists believe and some archaeologists are prepared to accept and so on. But some archaeologists don't want to rock the boat because it might interfere with their relationships, for example, with their funders. Now, you only have to talk to people in academic archaeology and also in developer-funded archaeology to know those are arguments that are current and have been for a long, long time, and in fact have been since at least the beginnings of PPG 16 and modern developer-funded archaeology.
Yeah, theory, methods and practice, deadlines, and the race to the bottom, so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
However, what I would say is that I know for a fact that there are people who actually don't give a hoot about what happens to the Stonehenge landscape, who felt as though this was descending into one type of archaeology dunking on another type of archaeology, and this is why I used the word bickering in this video title. This is why I think that there are more than two sides to this. I think there are at least three, if not more. And it's all because the focus on this one site has become so incredibly irresistible and so incredibly toxic. I mean, as I was saying to you the other day, to quote Aliens, take off, nuke the site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
And on one level, I don't disagree.
Go and have a picnic at Castle Rig. You know, that's a much nicer stone circle.
Yeah, but the point is, it's not in the middle of a World Heritage Site landscape.
No, that's true. It's in there,
and that's the point.
Yeah,
that's the point about Stonehenge. That's why it's so polarizing.
Yeah,
and there is, it is perfectly legitimate to argue that it is possible developer-funded archaeology engaging with that project has done so at the expense of appearing not to care that the scheme was found to be unlawful, was not supported by the government's independent inspectors, when archaeology is meant to be all about evidence and evidence-based argument and accepting the opinions of experts.
Yep.
And that UNESCO oppose the scheme.
Yeah. Now, I should say, folks, Andy and I had a 2.5-hour conversation about this a couple of days ago, and it got a little bit shouty at times. And the reason for that is the point I'm about to make, and I don't want to relitigate the whole conversation, but the point I'm about to make is that I don't believe that all archaeologists who have to engage with these projects to keep bread on the table are doing it cynically or in a way that's undermining professionalism. I think this is a management problem. This is a direction of travel for the industry problem, i.e. the race to the bottom when it comes to contracts. We'll do that for less, or indeed, ooh, look at that payday. We'll do anything for you.
Yes.
There are questions to be answered there, but I don't think that your job a day digging archaeologists do anything other than the best that they can within the parameters that they're given. And just as I couldn't afford to cease work on everything that I find troublesome at times, or every client I find annoying, not that there often are many, if any clients are watching, then I also don't think that it's a luxury that all archaeologists have to be completely ethical in their work. They can do good work within grey parameters, and I think that's possibly, you talk about realpolitik. I think this is archaeologique, as it were. It's a mess. It is a mess, and maybe the argument and the conversation needs to be directed at the people who are directing sites, who are directing even the direction of sites, if you see what I mean.
Right. I'd say two things to that. First of all, absolutely, it's a management problem. I think there is a real problem in our sector when senior managers, people who are meant to have a regard to the ethics of the profession, organisations who are meant to have a regard to the ethics of the profession and so on, find it acceptable to engage with a project which independent experts, high court judges, and a United Nations organisation say is not acceptable.
Yeah. And that's it, isn't it? That is the argument. That's it.
Yeah, it's nothing to do with the professionalism of the archaeology or how well the archaeology is going to be done. Kate Fielden said that. There's not an argument about how well the archaeology is going to be done. It's the fact that it shouldn't be necessary on that landscape, on that World Heritage Site landscape, because that project should not be going ahead in its current form.
Yeah.
And that's what it's about.
And there you go. We should have just landed in the conversation last Sunday and just said, no, bush. Fixed. On to the next one.
The thing is, Mark, it's not being fixed.
No. And
the other thing I would say is, again, I'm the first person to acknowledge we've all been there. We've all done things that we would perhaps rather not have done.
Yeah.
But there comes a point when I think everybody has to at least ask themselves, do I do this? Can I live with this? Or why can we not just wait to do this? Rather than, look, history is full of bad things being done by good people.
Mm-hmm.
And, okay, we're not talking about crimes against humanity or anything like that, but we are talking about an irrevocable change to something of what is regarded by the United Nations of being of universal value. And I think as a profession, we just need to be a bit more careful before we engage with that.
Okay. What I would say to folks at home is that we have a recording of the conversation we had the other day available on our OnlyFans website. If you want to, if you want to log in to hear some hot, angry archaeological action, then. Oh dear. Right. Thank you so much for your time today, Andy, as always. Thank you guys at home for listening, for watching, and for commenting below. Please do comment below, incidentally. And also thank you for everyone who has actually inspired an understanding of these points of view that we've tried to lay out. I mean, ultimately, I think at the very least, everyone who has a thought, an opinion, or indeed was having an outright argument the other day surrounding this, does so because they love and care about archaeology so much.
Yeah,
it's not,
absolutely.
For the most part, it's not people just being horrible. And hopefully we can continue with that understanding, at least, in the comments below. So please do. As we were saying a little earlier, please do, if you have a story that you wanted to consider, get in touch with us. There are various ways you can do that safely and securely, and we will treat your communications, if requested, with the utmost respect and anonymity. And also, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. As you heard in the sting, we have a Patreon, and Watching Brief could use your support. But anyway, thank you for listening. Until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.